And the thing to bear in mind when you're shopping is that GPU vendors use some common sense when they're deciding how much memory to put on a graphics card. There is no point putting 3 or 4 gigs on it because by the time you're gonna try to render that image, it's not gonna have enough power to do it anyway.
Yeah, about that one-liners, things have changed quite a bit since then. What's up everybody, welcome to We Do Tech. So today we are going to take a look at the brand new RTX 3060 gaming OC from Gigabyte and find out if Nvidia dropped the ball on the new RTX 3060. Now ever since Nvidia's announcement of the 3060 with 12 gigs of VRAM, we have been very curious to see actually how it would perform and what the target audience would actually be. The higher amount of VRAM would suggest that it's more aimed towards crypto mining, especially nowadays, instead of gaming, but that was quickly put to an end because Nvidia announced that they are going to limit binding performance by 50%. So will Juan be able to upgrade from his current GTX 1080 and get a decent performance boost? Or is it only going to be a good upgrade if you're going from something like a GTX 1060? Well, we're gonna find out. So starting off with specs, the RTX 3060 again has 12 gigs of VRAM, 3580 for CUDA cores, 112 third generation Tensor cores, 28 second generation RT cores, and on paper it's around a 45% increase compared to the RTX 2060 with the new generation of cores. Also, even though the 3060 does have more VRAM, it is slower with a 192-bit memory bus versus the 256-bit memory bus on the Ti version, but memory bandwidth is a bit more at 15 gigabits per second versus the 14 gigabits a second on the Ti. So even though you do have more memory, it is slightly a bit slower. Now our biggest concern with the 3060 was the strange amount of VRAM and just why 12 gigs. It can't even mine, so what is the purpose of this card exactly? Was it more intended towards content creators? I honestly don't think so because it's more of an entry-level card, or maybe for streamers. But again, I don't really think so. Most likely what happened was that Nvidia did plan to sell this card to more miners instead, but because of all of the backlash and the shortage and so on, they decided to rather not and listen to the people that actually made them who they are, us gamers. But now this is where we get into the biggest problem, and that is pricing. Because again, 12 gigs. It was aimed towards miners and they were going to pay for that 12 gigs, but now the gamers need to pay for the 12 gigs that they're never probably going to use because the card isn't going to be strong enough. So yeah, it's a weird predicament we're in. Now the RTX 3060 is supposed to retail for around $330 MSRP. However, with the whole GPU shortage and all of the miners just buying up everything and retailers just pushing up all of the prices and so on, price hikes have gone through the roof. You're probably going to pay more than 50% for this card, with some retailers already listing the card at around $520. That's even more than the RTX 3070 cost at launch. So you're theoretically paying for 2 generations above the card that you actually want to get. And that doesn't really fit well with me. But now with all of that aside, let's move on to actually taking a look at the Gigabyte Gaming RTX 3060 OC. It pretty much just looks like a smaller and a bit more plastic RTX 3060 Ti in my honest opinion. Now we still personally feel that Gigabyte went a bit too safe with the current gaming series on the 3000 series. We do feel that the previous generations were a lot more out there, which we did prefer, especially the Oris cards, but these ones are a lot more neutral design. The flat looking fan shroud does have some groove marks on it to try to give it some more dimensions, and the two-tone black and silver plastic does add some styling to it, but not too much. You do also get the white vision model as well, which for me personally looks just great. I currently have it in my system back there, and the white just gives it a bit more styling, even though the design still looks the same. So for me personally, I would rather go for that one. But of course, you do have the Aorus cards that you can go for, which does have more of that gaming look to them. Now, I do still personally like the backplate Gigabyte added with the silver aluminum and some Gigabyte branding with some graphics on. Now, you will notice that the 8-pin power connector does sit in the middle of the GPU now, where with the previous cards we saw it more towards the tail end, which you could also see the wiring towards the pin, which we weren't the biggest fans of. Now, the reason for the move of the connectors is that apparently it was a weak point on some of the other cards, where if you weren't too careful, it could potentially break there. So they moved it, and on the PCB board now, it's a lot stronger and more reliable. But now it's more towards the middle of the card, which might not look too great with cable management and so on. So it's just going to depend up to you what you personally prefer. It kind of looks like the Founders Edition cards now with, again, the connector in the middle. So yeah, take it for what you will. Now, you also get some RGB on the card. Again, on the tail end, you do get the Gigabyte logo and an RGB strip, which you can adjust the colors of there. And one of the first things that you will notice is, of course, that huge hole towards the back of the card, which does help with heat dissipation. But no, that's not the only thing that does keep the card cool. We do still have the WindForce 3 cooling system, like with the other gaming OC cards, but somehow these fans do look a bit smaller compared towards the other cards that we reviewed, even the 3060 Ti. Also, the middle fan does spin clockwise, whereas the outer fans do spin counterclockwise to reduce turbulence and improve cooling. Now, as for how it performs, under our gaming loads, we saw a max of 69 degrees Celsius, which isn't too bad. Moving on to I/O, the 3060 gaming OC is actually pretty well equipped here. It does have two HDMI 2.1 ports capable of a 4K 60 FPS, although this card will never be able to reach that, and two DisplayPort version 1.4As. Now, just before we get into the benchmarks, the drivers that we used were press release drivers, so they might even bring drivers out on the day of launch, which might improve gaming performance. So just keep that in mind. This is what we had, this is what we worked with, and this is the result that we got. The first up is two Assassin's Creed games, Valhalla on Ultra and on 1080p. We managed an average of 66 FPS, which is a 24% decrease from the 3060 Ti. The same amount was true for 1440p as well. But with a 4K, there was a 35% performance decrease, and I'm already wondering what that 12 gigs of VRAM is actually for. Now, moving on towards Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the gap was not that big here, at almost reaching a 90 FPS on a very high settings on 1080p. 1440p was not bad either, only being around 17% behind the 3060 Ti, but yet again, 4K was the downfall for the 3060, with yet another 37% performance gap between itself and the 3060 Ti. In Rainbow Six Siege, the 3060 was a dead lost on our charts, falling way behind with a total average of 30% on a DX11 against the 3060 Ti. Using Vulkan, it did manage to catch up a little, but still being behind 23%. In Far Cry New Dawn on a 1080p, it was a very close call, only being around 20% behind the 3060 Ti, which was our top performer in 1080p so far. In 1440p, it was a very close race between the GPUs, well, until the 3060 came into play, being a whopping 27% behind the 3060 Ti, which might not sound like that much, but there was only a 13% difference here between the 3060 Ti and our 3090 at that time. And then yet again, another 36% slower than the 3060 Ti in 4K. So that extra VRAM currently does not seem to be doing that much at all. Now, we did see that with our previous 3090 reviews that on Horizon Zero Dawn, it did like to eat up a lot of VRAM. So maybe on this game, it'll actually be able to flex somewhat. So on 1080p and 1440p, it was actually 28% behind the 3060 Ti, and on 4K, a wholesome 34%. And I really thought that this was the game that the card would actually show how it could perform. perform. Then next up in Apex Legends, in 1080p it managed to get 198 FPS, which is actually pretty good, only being around a 4% behind the 2080 Super. In 1440p it got 139 FPS, but it was also around 44% behind the 3060 Ti in both 1440p and 4K. But now let's find out if the 3060 can actually run a Cyberpunk. So in 1080p we did hit over 60 FPS, which was actually pretty good, and with DLSS on we got over 85 FPS, which again is a decent. But throw ray tracing in there and it almost drops in half at 44 FPS. And then if you remove a DLSS completely, it drops all the way down to 25 FPS. How about a 1440p? Well, on normal rasterizer test, it got a 41 FPS, and with help with DLSS, it got over 60 FPS, and again, not bad. But when you throw ray tracing in there, it did start to become very laggy with only 29 FPS, and without a DLSS, it only managed to get 15 FPS, so definitely not playable without it. Now in Control running at 1080p with DLSS on and off as well as RTX, we only got an average of about 20% less than the 3060 Ti. 1440p there was a 30% difference on average, and 4K was even worse, being about 38% behind the 3060 Ti. Wolfenstein Youngblood was our last ray tracing game to test. In 1080p it was an average of 26% behind the 3060 Ti, but actually beat out the 2080 Super in every test. Not bad. In 1440p it was a different story, although falling behind again by a margin of about 30%. 4K was more or less the same result. Our last game to test was Call of Duty Modern Warfare. In 1080p, the 3060 was unfortunately dead last again, only reaching 168 FPS. That's around 35% behind the 3060 Ti. Now it is worth mentioning that the 3060 Ti on 1080p was the top card in these tests throughout, actually beating all the other 30 series cards as well. In 1440p, the gap was also 35% between the 3060 and the 3060 Ti. On 4K, the 3060 was just able to reach 60 FPS, but it was still lagging behind by a margin of 36%. So from the benchmarks, we can see that the 3060 series cards aren't really that great. And I'm not blaming Gigabyte here at all. It's mostly an Nvidia that didn't make a proper card. On all of the price details that Nvidia actually gave the reviewers, the only cards that they could compare it to was the RTX 2060 non-super and a 5-year-old card, the GTX 1060, and also no mention on what 1060 it actually was, because I did actually bring out 5 different ones throughout the years. Also, something that didn't make sense at all is that Nvidia stated that it does have 10 times the ray tracing performance compared to the 1060, which doesn't have ray tracing at all. So that's not something to brag about entirely. Honestly, don't know what's going on there. And also, Nvidia ray tracing has not become the standard yet. They did mention that. It's not at all. There's not enough ray tracing games out yet, so I'm not sure why they said that. Alright, but now with all of that out of the way, Nvidia wanted to compare it to the 1060, so we thought, why not throw it in there and see actually how the 3060 performs against a 5-year-old card, the GTX 1060 6GB, one of the 5 cards. So for the test against the 1060 6GB, we did benchmark Apex Legends, Control, and Call of Duty. We also did compare it in Firestrike and Time Spare as well. So first up was Apex Legends. The 3060 did manage to perform a whopping 160% more than the 1060 6GB, both being on medium settings. Control was a second, and in rasterizer test with a medium settings, it did beat out the 1060 by 103%. And of course, because you do have the advantage of a DLSS with the 3060, when switching that on, it boosted all the way up to 200% more than the 1060. And then lastly was Call of Duty Modern Warfare. With both of the cards on the lowest settings, the difference was around 60%. Now, I guess that wasn't enough of a challenge to utilize all that 12 gigs of VRAM, which yeah, it's such a waste. And then just finally, we did compare it again in 3D Mark's Firestrike, where we got a graphics score of 22,267. That's around a 65% increase over the 1060. And in Time Spy, we got a score of 8,441, which is a staggering increase of 85%, which isn't bad. All right, so anyway, this card is aimed towards minors, gamers. I'm not entirely sure really, but of course it's designed for gamers, so that's what Nvidia does. But just like I mentioned in the beginning, I do personally feel that this card was intentionally made for miners with that 12 gigs of VRAM instead of being actually a gaming card. It could do both. It could mine, it could game, and if they just put it out as that, I wouldn't be so mad about it really, because if you bought this card, you could mine with it for the time being until everything crashes, and you would kind of have been able to maybe pay off some of the card. So I wouldn't have been too mad about that. But being that they reduced the mining performance completely, now you're just paying for a card that has 12 gigs of VRAM that you're never really going to use, which doesn't make sense. So you're paying for unused performance. So I honestly feel that the 3060 doesn't have that big of a use case because of how badly it performed compared to the 3060 Ti. That card again is just a beast of a card for what you're actually paying. Even though it is still the price did go up quite a bit, it's still a very good card. You can compare it to the 2080 Super where it beats that, and it does very well in just all regards, and you can of course mine with it if you wanted to and just get a bit of extra cash while everything does actually make money, which you can. But instead, if you go for the 3060, you're going to pay for a card that doesn't perform well at all while paying actually for a 3070 at current pricing. So it's honestly a no-brainer that I would honestly just rather go for the 3060 Ti instead. However, we do feel that if Nvidia was able to drop the price by around 10 to 20% and cut the 12 gigs of VRAM down to, let's say, around 8, that would actually not be too bad. The prices would be down. Of course, the VRAM wouldn't be useful anyway, and I think that would be a much better card to actually take a look at. And the miners in general wouldn't really care that much about the card anyway. The miners will anyway buy this card no matter if the performance does drop. They just want a card to mine with. Because paying the same price as a 3070 for 30% less performance than a 3060 Ti is not worth it for one to upgrade from his 1080. Just not worth it. But now that's pretty much it. If you guys enjoyed the review, please like, share, comment, comment like always. If you want to get this card for yourself, I will leave links in the video description once it's actually available and if there's a stock. And a big apologize to Gigabyte for just their rant in general. They didn't. It's not necessarily their fault that the card performed this badly. They just made a decent card and it was unfortunately on a bad chip from Nvidia. So that is where it is. Again, rather upgrade to a 3060 Ti and you're gonna be a lot happier, or wait for, let's say, a 3050 Ti. I think that'll be a good budget option if Nvidia doesn't bugger up it again like they currently did. But anyway, thanks for watching guys, and I will check all of you next time. Cheers guys.